mess of pulleys and carbon fiber, the kid's compound bow looked more like a satellite dish than a weapon. He smirked at my scuffed recurve, told me the local history museum was missing an exhibit. He didn't know the wood was older than his father, or that the man holding it had stopped flinching in 1974. The Pine Ridge Archery Club smelled exactly the way it had for the last 20 years, like damp cardboard, floor wax, and stale Folgers coffee burning at the bottom of a glass pot. It was a Tuesday morning. The air inside the converted warehouse was thick and stagnant, humming with the low, irritating buzz of failing fluorescent tubes. Augustus sat on a folding metal chair behind lane 4. He spent a solid 2 minutes just staring at his hands. His knuckles were swollen, red at the joints, looking more like knotty pine than bone and flesh. The barometric pressure had dropped overnight, bringing a low-grade ache that settled deep into his right shoulder. It was a familiar ache. He didn't hate it. He just accommodated it. He unzipped the faded green canvas case resting across his knees. The brass zipper caught halfway, same as it always did, and he had to yank it with a grunt of mild frustration. Inside lay his bow. It wasn't a tactical piece of hardware. It was a bare grizzly recurve, 58 inches of laminated maple and olive drab fiberglass. No sights, no stabilizers protruding from the front. No mechanical cams or pulleys to shoulder the weight of the draw. Just wood, fiberglass, and a Flemish twist string heavily coated in beeswax. Augustus picked it up. The leather grip was dark and slick from decades of palm sweat and natural oils. He slid the bottom loop of the string into the lower nock, stepped through the bow, and bent the limbs across his thigh to loop the top string in place. The wood gave a faint, structural groan as it bent to his will. His shoulder gave a similar, meteor complaint. He was just reaching into his quiver for his shooting glove when the front door of the range banged open. A rush of cold street air disrupted the stale quiet, followed immediately by the abrasive sound of loud, unearned confidence. 3 young men walked in. They were in their 20s, wearing clothes that looked too clean to be outdoorsy, crisp, tactical pants with too many pockets, moisture-wicking shirts pulled tight across gym-built chests, and flat-brimmed caps. The loudest one in the middle was carrying a hard-shell Pelican case that looked like it belonged on a military tarmac. He slammed it down on the sorting table behind lane 5, right next to Augustus. Augustus didn't look up. He just rubbed his thumb over the hardened leather of his finger tab. The smell of Axe body spray drifted over, sickly sweet and metallic, completely overpowering the comforting scent of cedar arrow shafts. "I'm telling you, the let-off on this thing is insane," the kid said, flipping the heavy latches on his case. 85%. You can hold it at full draw all day while you wait for a buck to turn broadside. Augustus kept his eyes on his own gear. He pulled a wooden arrow from his quiver, inspecting the turkey feathers. The glue at the base of the fletching was starting to yellow. The kid pulled his weapon from the foam interior. It was a mechanical monstrosity, a matte black compound bow heavily machined from aircraft-grade aluminum. It had a web of cables, massive eccentric wheels at both ends, a fiber optic pin sight that glowed neon green, and a front stabilizer that looked like a carbon fiber shock absorber. The kid Augustus mentally dubbed him Carbon stepped up to the line in lane 5. He didn't bother to stretch. He didn't bother to check if anyone else was ready. He just clipped a mechanical release to his D-loop, drew the bow back in one swift, jerky motion, and punched the trigger. Thwack. The mechanical violence of the compound bow was loud in the empty room. The carbon arrow buried itself deep into the foam block at 20 yards, dead center. "Dialed in," Carbon said, looking back at his 2 friends who offered appreciative nods. Augustus stood up. His knees popped in sequence, left, then picked up his recurve and stepped up to the line in lane 4. He planted his feet, straddling the white painted line on the concrete floor. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, settling his breathing. The tinnitus in his left ear was a high-pitched hiss, a permanent souvenir from a mortar shell in Quezon that never quite let him forget the dirt and the noise. He pushed the sound to the back of his mind. He knocked his wooden arrow. The satisfying click of the plastic knock snapping onto the string was a small comfort. Carbon leaned over the wooden divider, separating their lanes. He looked Augustus up and down. He looked at the faded flannel shirt, the worn denim, and finally, the simple wooden bow. "Hey, Chief," Carbon said. Augustus didn't lower his bow, but he turned his head slightly. "Yeah. They still make arrows for that thing, or do you have to whittle them out in the woods?" The kid grinned. His friend snickered. Augustus felt a slow, tired knot form in his stomach. It wasn't rage. He was too old for rage. It was just a profound, heavy exhaustion at the predictability of people. He looked at Carbon's bow, then back to the kid's face. "They make them," Augustus said, his voice gravelly, barely above a murmur. He turned back to his target. He raised his bow arm, pushed the 50-pound draw weight back to the corner of his mouth, anchored his index finger against his canine tooth, and let the string slip from his leather glove. Thump. The arrow flew in a high arc, much slower than Carbon's dart-like projectile. It hit the target a few inches high and slightly to the left of the center ring. A solid shot for a traditional bow with no sights, but miles away from the pinpoint precision of the compound. Carbon chuckled. "Nice. Seriously, though, that belongs in a museum behind some glass. You're going to pull a muscle trying to drag that string back. Progress happened for a reason, you know." Augustus lowered his bow. He looked at his arrow in the target. It was off. His release was sloppy. His mind had been on the kid, not the target. He hated that. He hated that he let a 20-something with a credit card and a catalog break his focus. He turned to fully face Carbon. The kid was resting his high-tech bow on his hip, looking smug, waiting for a reaction. Augustus didn't puff out his chest. He didn't square his shoulders. He just stood there, a slightly stooped 72-year-old man with bad joints. "A museum," Augustus repeated quietly. "Yeah, like alongside the muskets and the stone wheels," Carbon said, encouraged by the interaction. Augustus looked at the target 20 yards downrange. Then he looked at the mechanical release strapped to the kid's wrist. "You don't release that string," Augustus pointed out, his tone flat. "You pull a trigger. You're not shooting a bow, son. You're firing a spring-loaded rifle." Carbon's smile vanished, replaced by a defensive sneer. "It's called efficiency. It puts meat in the freezer. Not sure that stick of yours could punch through a wet paper bag." "Maybe," Augustus said. He reached into his quiver and pulled out another arrow. He didn't really want to do this. It was petty. It was beneath him. The Corps had drilled the ego out of him decades ago, leaving only discipline. But sometimes, the discipline needed a minor vacation. "Tell you what," Augustus said, his voice lacking any theatrical challenge. $20 says you can't outshoot a museum piece." The silence in the archery range thickened. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim slightly in anticipation. Carbon's two friends stopped scrolling on their phones and stepped up to the glass partition, smirking. Carbon stared at Augustus, then let out a short, sharp laugh. "You're serious? Grandpa, I don't want to take your bingo money." "It's pension money," Augustus corrected him, devoid of humor. "And it spends just fine. 3 arrows, closest to the X wins. Unless you're worried your batteries might die." Carbon flushed. It was a cheap shot. Compound bows don't use batteries. but the implication hit home. "All right, you're on. $20. I'll even let you shoot first." "I'm already on the line," Augustus said. He didn't rush. The anger in his gut was a cold, slow-burning thing. He had to suppress it. Archery was a game of subtraction. You had to subtract the noise, subtract the pain in your shoulder, subtract the smug idiot breathing Axe body spray 2 feet away. If you held on to anything, it transferred into the limbs of the bow and threw the arrow off. Augustus raised the bow. He focused on the gold center of the target, a circle no bigger than a coffee cup. He felt the familiar, rough texture of the leather tab against his fingertips. As he drew the string back, his right shoulder ground in its socket, a sharp, localized spike of pain that he acknowledged and immediately discarded. He anchored his finger to the corner of his mouth. He didn't have a glowing green pin to place over the target. He had to feel the trajectory. He had to rely on a neural pathway carved by hundreds of thousands of repetitions over 40 years. The gap between the arrow tip and the target. The tension in his back muscles. Release. The string slipped away. The recurve thumped, sending a vibration down his forearm. The arrow struck the target bag with a heavy smack. It landed inside the gold ring. A 10. Not a dead center spiderweb hit, but a solid 10. Carbon raised his eyebrows. Lucky shot. My turn. The kid stepped up. He was all mechanics. He clipped his release onto the D-loop. He drew back. Because of the let-off on his cams, he was only holding about 10 pounds of weight at full draw, compared to the 50 pounds Augustus had to hold on his fingers. Carbon took his time. He peered through the peep sight tied into his string, aligned it with the glowing pin, hovered it over the center, and squeezed his trigger. Thwack! The carbon arrow slammed into the target, burying itself up to the fletching. Dead center, the X-ring. "That," Carbon said, lowering his bow with a satisfied grin, "is how you do it with technology." Augustus didn't say a word. He just pulled his second arrow. The internal contradiction gnawed at Augustus. He knew the kid's equipment was objectively superior for accuracy. A machine will always beat a man in consistency. He was fighting a losing battle against physics and engineering. It was foolish. Yet, as he slid the wooden shaft across the hair rest of his bow, a stubborn, irrational pride flared up. He wasn't just shooting against Carbon. He was shooting against the obsolescence the kid represented. Augustus drew again. This time, the draw felt heavier. His breath was a little shorter. He held at anchor for an extra second, willing his muscles to freeze, fighting the microtremors in his bow arm. He stared at the gold ring until it seemed to blur and expand in his vision. Slip. The arrow flew. It hit the target right next to his first one. Another 10, but just on the edge of the line. Augustus exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His shoulder throbbed relentlessly now. Carbon stepped up for his second shot. He was relaxed. Too relaxed. He drew back, anchored, and punched the trigger a fraction of a second too fast. Thwack! The arrow hit the target, but it drifted right. It landed in the 9 ring. The kid frowned, lowering his bow and examining his grip. Slipped. Release is a little light. Augustus looked at the target. 1 arrow left. The score was tied. 10 and a 10 for Augustus. 10 and a 9 for Carbon. If Carbon hit the X on his last shot, and Augustus only managed a 9, Carbon would win. "Equipment issue?" Augustus asked softly, not looking at the kid. "Just a fluke." Carbon snapped. "I got this." Augustus pulled his third and final arrow. The feathers on this one were slightly frayed. He rolled the shaft between his fingers. He felt old. Incredibly old. The humid air of the range suddenly felt oppressive. The hum of the lights grew louder, syncing with the ringing in his ear. He didn't want to shoot this arrow. He wanted to pack up, go home, sit in his armchair, and ice his shoulder. He looked at his swollen knuckles. They were trembling slightly. He looked over at Carbon. The kid was checking his sight housing, twisting a small Allen key to make a micro adjustment. He relied on the machine to fix his mistake. Augustus closed his eyes. No machines, he thought. Just the wood, just the string, just the bone. He opened his eyes, raised the recurve, and pushed the bow arm out. He drew the string back, dragging the 50 pounds of tension across his battered joints. He anchored. He didn't look at his arrow tip. He didn't look at the gap. He stared exclusively at the tiny, dead center of the gold ring, willing his hand to align with his eye. His back muscles bunched. The strain was immense. He held the tension for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. His fingers relaxed. The arrow cleared the bow. The heavy wooden shaft traveled downrange in a parabolic curve that felt agonizingly slow. It didn't cut the air. It shoved its way through. Smack. The sound was duller than the sharp crack of the carbon arrows. A heavy, dense impact of cedar, burying itself into tightly compressed synthetic foam. Augustus didn't immediately lower his arm. He kept his follow-through frozen, his right hand resting just behind his ear, his left arm extended like a dead branch. He didn't need spotting scopes or glowing fiber optics to see it. The yellow fletching of his arrow was protruding right from the center of the gold. The X-ring, it was crammed so tightly next to his first 2 arrows that the feathers were touching. 30 points out of a possible 30. Augustus finally lowered his bow. The adrenaline, which had been a thin, cold wire holding his posture together, snapped. Immediately, the dull roar of his rotator cuff flared into a sharp, grinding protest. He rotated his left shoulder, feeling the grit in the joint. He didn't look at Carbon. He just stared at the concrete floor, suddenly hyper-aware of how badly his lower back ached. He felt a brief, hollow flash of embarrassment. He was a grown man, a veteran, getting dragged into a pissing contest with a child over a piece of fiberglass and wood. The silence in the building was absolute, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint rattling of the heating vent near the ceiling. Carbon's 2 friends had stopped leaning against the glass partition. One of them actually took a step back, as if the physical space around Lane 5 had suddenly become hazardous. Carbon stood perfectly still. The smug relaxation had bled out of his face, leaving behind a tight, pale mask. He stared down the 20 yards. He blinked once, hard, then looked down at his own bow. The $1,500 matte black machine with its intricate cams, its counterweights, its drop-away arrow rest. He needed an X just to tie. If he hit the 10 ring, he lost. If he drifted into the 9, he lost. The math was brutally simple, and it hung in the stale, axe-scented air between them. "Your turn," Augustus said. His voice was completely devoid of triumph. It was just a statement of fact. Carbon swallowed. The sound was audible. He wiped his right hand, his release hand, down the side of his tactical pants. He unclipped his release from the string, checked the jaw mechanism, and clipped it back on. It was a nervous twitch, a stalling tactic. He stepped up to the line. His stance, which had been aggressively wide and arrogant before, now looked rigid. He raised the compound bow. Augustus watched him from the corner of his eye. He recognized the signs. It didn't matter if you were holding a rifle in a jungle or a toy in a warehouse. The body betrayed the mind exactly the same way. Carbon's breathing had moved to his upper chest. Short, shallow gasps. He drew the bow back. The let-off kicked in. Carbon was only holding 10 pounds of weight, but his bow arm was vibrating. It wasn't muscle fatigue. It was pure, unadulterated nerves. It was the sudden, crushing weight of an audience. Through the peep sight, Carbon's glowing green pin must have been dancing a chaotic jig over the gold ring. Augustus knew the kid was waiting for the pin to settle perfectly in the center. He was waiting for the machine to tell him it was okay to fire, but the machine only amplifies the shooter. If the shooter is shaking, the machine shakes violently. Carbon held the draw. 4 seconds. 5, 6. Too long, Augustus thought tiredly. You're starving your brain of oxygen. Let down. Reset. But the kid didn't let down. Pride wouldn't allow it. His jaw clenched tight. He was fighting the bow now, trying to force the pin to stop moving by bearing down on the grip. The knuckles on his left hand turned white. Panic took over. He couldn't hold it anymore. Instead of a smooth, surprise release, Carbon's index finger mashed down on the mechanical trigger like he was swatting a fly. Thwack. The bow jumped in his hand, a violent spasm of misdirected energy. The Carbon arrow rocketed downrange. It didn't hit the gold. It completely bypassed the red 9 ring. It slammed into the blue-painted circle of the target bag. A 7. Carbon froze. His bow arm was still extended, but it was drooping. He stared at the blue ring, his mouth slightly open. He looked like someone had just told him the earth was flat and proved it with a Polaroid. One of his friends behind the glass let out a low, breathy whistle. Carbon lowered the bow. The machined aluminum clicked against his belt buckle. He didn't look at Augustus. He just stared straight ahead, his chest heaving under his tight, moisture-wicking shirt. The smell of his cheap cologne suddenly seemed sour, mixed with the sharp, acidic scent of nervous sweat. Augustus didn't say a word. He didn't smile. He didn't feel vindicated. He just felt incredibly tired. He reached down, grabbed his worn canvas case, and picked it up. "Let's go pull him," Augustus said, his voice flat. They walked down the concrete aisle together. Augustus walked with a deliberate, stiff-legged gait, his old boots scraping slightly against the floor. Carbon walked beside him, his head down, clutching his expensive compound bow by the stabilizer. The 20 yards felt like a mile. When they reached the target bales, the visual evidence was stark. Augustus's 3 wooden arrows were clustered tightly in the center, a messy clump of yellow and white feathers. Carbon's 3 arrows were scattered an X, a 9, and the catastrophic 7 sitting out in the blue like a lonely, expensive mistake. Augustus reached out and gripped his first wooden arrow near the foam face. He gave it a sharp twist to break the friction, then pulled. The wood gave a dull, tearing sound as it came free. He pulled the second, then the third. He tucked them under his arm, the feathers brushing against his flannel shirt. Carbon stepped up to his arrows. He grabbed the one in the blue ring. He pulled, but it didn't budge. Carbon arrows fused to synthetic foam under high-speed friction. He had to brace his knee against the target bale and heave with both hands. It popped out with a high-pitched, synthetic squeal. The kid pulled the remaining 2 in silence. He stood there, holding his slick, modern projectiles, looking at the ragged holes left in the target face. Augustus turned to walk back to the line. "Wait," Carbon said. His voice was tight, stripped of the bravado from 10 minutes ago. Augustus stopped and looked over his shoulder. Carbon shoved a hand into the pocket of his tactical pants. He pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. He didn't hold it out aggressively. He just extended his hand, his eyes fixed on the concrete between Augustus's boots. "You won," the kid muttered. Augustus looked at the bill. It was creased, soft from being sat on. He didn't want the money. It felt petty to take it, but he also knew that if he didn't take it, he was insulting the kid worse than beating him did. A bet was a bet. It was a contract. Augustus reached out with his swollen, calloused fingers and took the bill. He folded it once and slipped it into his chest pocket, buttoning the flap over it. Thanks, Augustus said. Carbon finally looked up. There was no anger in his eyes now, just a profound, frustrated confusion. He looked at Augustus's recurve, leaning against the target frame, then down at his own mechanical marvel. I don't get it, Carbon said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I have the best sight on the market, a drop-away rest. I tuned the paper tear myself. That bow, he gestured weakly toward Augustus's equipment. It doesn't even have a center-cut riser. It's physically impossible for it to be that consistent. Augustus sighed, a deep, rattling breath that felt like it carried the weight of the last 40 years. He looked at the kid. He saw the expensive gear, the manicured haircut, the desperate need for a shortcut to competence. You're right, Augustus said slowly. The bow isn't consistent. Wood bends with the humidity. The string stretches. The arrows fly a little different every time. Carbon frowned. Then, how? Because you're trusting the machine to do the shooting for you, Augustus said. He pointed a knotty finger at the mechanical release strapped to Carbon's wrist. You wait for that pin to stop moving. You panic when it doesn't. You punch the trigger because you want the shot to be over. You're a passenger, son. Augustus reached over and picked up his recurve. He ran a thumb over the worn leather grip, feeling the permanent indentations left by his own hand over thousands of hours. I don't have a pin, Augustus continued, his voice dropping into a quiet, gravelly rhythm. I don't have cams holding the weight. When I pull that string back, it hurts. Every time, it shakes. But I don't fight the shaking. I don't wait for it to be perfect, because it never is. You just have to accept the wobble, anchor it in your bone, and let the string slip when it feels right. Not when it looks right. Carbon stared at him. The kid's jaw worked, turning the words over. For the first time since he walked into the building, he actually looked like he was listening, rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. Augustus turned away. He walked back to lane 4. He didn't pack up with a flourish. He laid the recurve in the canvas case. He unstrung it, the wood groaning one last time as the tension released. He slid the brass zipper shut. It caught halfway. He yanked it, grunted, and pulled it the rest of the way. He slung the case over his shoulder. The strap bit into his collarbone. He picked up his quiver and walked toward the exit. As he passed lane 5, Carbon was still standing by the targets, his 2 friends hovering awkwardly behind him. None of them said a word. Augustus pushed the heavy glass door open. The cold Tuesday morning air hit him instantly, washing away the smell of floor wax and body spray. The traffic on the street was loud, an endless, metallic grind of commuters heading to places they didn't want to be. Augustus pulled his collar up against the chill. His shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat. His knees ached. He reached into his chest pocket, his fingers brushing against the folded $20 bill. It was enough to buy a pound of decent coffee. Not the stale Folgers they brewed inside, but something dark and oily. He began the slow walk to his truck, the canvas bow case thumping gently against his back with every step. The kid was right about one thing. It probably did belong in a museum, but not today.